It all started on what should have been an ordinary Thursday morning. Instead, I walked right into chaos. A bright red citation was plastered to my front door, held down with so much duct tape that it looked like someone was trying to keep evidence from escaping. 550 noise violation, it screamed in bold, angry letters. The timestamp read Thursday, 3:23 a.m. I stood there, luggage still in hand, staring in utter disbelief. 3:17 in the morning? That was impossible. At that exact time, I was 32,000 feet over Kansas, winging my way home from a cybersecurity conference in Seattle. I had my boarding pass, conference badge, and even the flight app still open on my phone to prove it. The only noise I'd made that night was snoring softly in seat 12C, while a grandmother beside me told me endless stories of her grandson's baseball stats. And that's when it hit me. Margaret Whitmore had finally lost her mind. Margaret wasn't just any neighbor. She was the self-proclaimed queen of Maple Ridge Estates, the HOA president, judge, and executioner of all things community standards. From the moment I moved in 8 months ago, she treated me like a virus in her perfect little suburb. In her world, everyone smiled the same, mowed the same, and lived by her rules. Apparently, being a 42-year-old divorced software engineer made me a threat to her family values. Margaret ran the HOA like a military operation. Her gray hair was styled into a helmet so solid that it could probably survive a hurricane, and her smile carried all the warmth of a parking ticket. She used a laser level to measure fence heights, fined neighbors for unapproved chalk art, and even counted the flowers in people's gardens to enforce her bizarre, odd-number rule. Her HOA meetings felt less like gatherings and more like interrogations. Before crowning herself the queen of the cul-de-sac, Margaret had been a mid-level bank manager, until harassment complaints sent her packing. After that, she found her new kingdom in Maple Ridge. She turned her garage into an HOA command center, replete with file cabinets of violations and a whiteboard tracking neighbors in color-coded markers. She even printed business cards that read, Margaret Whitmore, President and Chief Compliance Officer. But her greatest obsession? Single men. We unmarried residents attracted bad elements and corrupted the family-friendly atmosphere. We probably ran illegal poker games or underground clubs in our basements, according to her logic. For the record, mine had nothing more than a treadmill and dusty tax returns, but try convincing her of that. So when I found that citation, I knew this wasn't about noise. It was about power. I immediately pulled up my smart home recordings. The footage told the truth. Between 5 p.m. and 6 a.m., there was no movement, no lights, no visitors. Then I checked my front camera and froze. At 3:07 a.m., there she was, Margaret creeping across my lawn, clutching something in her hand. She stood outside my living room window for nearly 4 minutes, then vanished into the dark. At 3:13 a.m., the speakers blasted heavy metal. Not from inside my house, but right outside it. I zoomed in. The object in her hand was a portable speaker, one of those waterproof Bluetooth ones people use for pool parties. She had planted it against my window, blasted music for 2.5 minutes, then ran off, all while wearing her official HOA blazer, embroidered with President Whitmore in gold thread. And the best part? My camera had night vision. Her face was crystal clear. That was it. I copied the footage onto a flash drive, grabbed my car keys, and drove straight to the police station. Officer James Bradley reviewed the video in silence. Then with a raised eyebrow, he muttered, "Yeah, you clearly weren't home. And this such," he pointed at the screen, "this is serious harassment." Together we went to confront her. Margaret opened the door, still wearing her blazer like a badge of honor. The color drained from her face the second she saw the officer beside me. She launched into her usual HOA lecture about maintaining standards and preserving neighborhood values. Officer Bradley calmly asked for her documentation of my violations. She stammered, admitting they were verbal complaints from concerned residents. Then I pulled out my phone and showed her the footage, her sneaking across my lawn at 3:07 a.m. Her face turned ghost white. She tried to spin it, claiming she was investigating suspicious activity. But the timeline betrayed her. According to her own citation, the noise started at 3:12 a.m. Then I played the audio, the heavy metal blasting from outside my window. Margaret's hands began to shake. She sputtered excuses, said maybe someone else did it, and accused me of tampering with the footage. Finally, Officer Bradley asked if she owned a portable speaker. First, she said no. Then yes, for emergencies. Then suddenly it had been stolen. When asked if she filed a police report about that theft, she claimed she'd been too busy with HOA business. At that point, even Officer Bradley couldn't hide a smirk. The self-proclaimed Queen of Maple Ridge had just dug her own grave. That's when she made the biggest mistake of her life. Margaret crossed her arms, straightened her blazer, and said coldly, "Even if you weren't home, you're still responsible for your property, and whoever might have been there." But then she slipped. Without thinking, she added, "Besides, I know you were away at that conference." The air went still. I hadn't told anyone where I'd been. Not a single neighbor knew I'd gone to Seattle, let alone that it was for a cybersecurity conference. The color drained from her face as she realized what she'd just said. She tried to backpedal, claiming she'd simply assumed I was out of town because my car wasn't in the driveway. But Officer Bradley calmly asked her how she knew it was specifically a conference, and her story began to unravel fast. First, she said she'd overheard it somewhere. Then she said a neighbor mentioned it at the grocery store. And finally, she claimed it was just a lucky guess. But it was too late. She'd already exposed herself. Officer Bradley's tone hardened. He reminded her that filing false complaints was a criminal offense, and her repeated targeting of specific residents could qualify as harassment and stalking. That's when Margaret snapped. The fake smile vanished. The polished HOA president facade cracked wide open. What came out next wasn't professionalism, it was venom. She started screaming about single men ruining neighborhoods, claiming I probably threw wild parties when she wasn't watching, that someone had to maintain order. I recorded every single word, and then came the confession that sealed her fate. In her rage, Margaret blurted out that she'd been monitoring my travel schedule through a friend who worked for the airline. The room fell dead silent. Even Officer Bradley's expression darkened. That was stalking, plain and simple. He immediately wrote up a report, recommending charges for harassment, stalking, and filing false police reports. Margaret had finally gone too far. Over the next 3 days, I started reaching out to my neighbors. What I heard made my stomach turn. David Park, a National Guard officer, told me he'd been fined $320 for a broken window while he was deployed overseas. The kicker? That window never existed. The Andersons had received citations for cars that weren't even theirs. Jennifer Santos, another single resident, was fined for inappropriate curtains. Her curtains were the exact same model and color as Margaret's own. Then came the story that broke everyone's heart, from Robert and Susan Phillips, an elderly couple who had lived in the neighborhood for over 20 years. Margaret fined them $800 for unsightly medical equipment on their porch. That equipment was Robert's wheelchair ramp. When they told her it was medically necessary, Margaret said, illness was no excuse for eyesores. Then she told them they should move to a nursing home if they couldn't maintain community standards. Susan was in tears as she related how they'd paid the fine out of their fixed income, terrified that Margaret would have them evicted. Then there was Marcus Thompson, a veteran and EMT who worked night shifts. Margaret repeatedly fined him for parking his car in his driveway in the daytime. Why? It violates the spirit of residential parking. Rules, most people are at work. Then, she even tried to pass a rule banning all vehicles from driveways from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., which would effectively discriminate against anyone who works nights. That's when it hit us. This wasn't just harassment. It was a systematic abuse of power. 14 of us banded together and hired an HOA lawyer, William Howarth, a legend in HOA law. After reading our files, he actually laughed out loud in disbelief. This, he said, is one of the worst cases of HOA corruption I've ever seen. He immediately filed for an emergency HOA meeting. Margaret sensed rebellion and went into overdrive. She sent out newsletters accusing a small group of troublemakers of trying to destroy community values. But the neighborhood wasn't buying her lies anymore. On Tuesday night, the community center was standing room only. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Margaret sat at the head of the long table, grasping her gavel like a weapon. Her knuckles were white, her lips trembling. She started the meeting with her usual self-righteous monologue about leadership and sacrifice. Her voice dripped fake nobility, trying to regain control. Then William stood up calm, composed, holding a folder nearly 2 inches thick. 23 false complaints in 18 months, he began. A consistent pattern of discrimination against single residents. Over $16,000 in missing fine revenue. The room exploded. Voices arose from every direction. Questions, anger, and disbelief. Someone hollered that Margaret's nephew had been given $40,000 for pool maintenance. Just one problem. There was no pool. Another neighbor said they'd seen HOA bought plants in Margaret's own front yard. Margaret slammed her gavel down so hard the handle snapped in two. "This meeting is out of order," she screamed. "I'll fine every one of you for disorderly conduct." That's when I stood up. I played the recording. Her voice loud and clear, ranting about single men, admitting to monitoring my travel schedule through an airline contact. The room went silent except for her voice echoing off the walls. When it ended, you could hear a pin drop. The board didn't hesitate. One member stood up and called for an immediate vote to remove her from office. Margaret shouted that the vote was illegal, but William calmly read from the bylaws. Emergency removal was authorized in cases involving criminal conduct. The results came in 58-2. Only Margaret and her loyal friend Eleanor voted in her favor. She tried to save face by announcing she was resigning voluntarily, but the board insisted on recording it as an official removal for cause. Within a week, the district attorney filed 19 counts of false reporting, each carrying fines and potential jail time. Our civil lawsuit, backed by 15 families, demanded $420,000 in damages. Then came the state investigation. It uncovered $44,000 in embezzled HOA funds. Margaret had been siphoning money for 2 years, funneling fines through her nephew's fake maintenance company. At her trial, her lawyer claimed she suffered from an obsessive control disorder, but prosecutors shredded that defense by revealing her own emails, ones where she bragged to her sister about driving out the undesirables while making a tidy profit doing it. Then came the bombshell. The forensic team recovered deleted pages from her personal journal. Inside, she described her twisted purification plan for Maple Ridge Estates. She called single men predators, single women loose, and renters temporary trash. She even rated her fake complaints like restaurant reviews. Noise violation, 4 out of 5 stars. Should have made it drugs instead, harder to disprove. It was monstrous. Investigators confirmed she had embezzled more than $60,000 total, using HOA money for luxury vacations, jewelry, and even her own mortgage. When the verdict was read, the courtroom fell silent. Margaret Whitmore, once the most feared woman in Maple Ridge, had been convicted on all counts. The judge gave her 3 years in prison, 18 months behind bars, and 5 years probation. He ordered her to pay full restitution plus an additional $220,000 in civil damages. But he wasn't finished. He leveled a lifetime ban prohibiting her from ever serving on an HOA board again, and ordered 500 hours of community service, helping single-parent households, the very demographic she had once despised. The real estate board later yanked her professional license, ending her so-called career for good. When the sentence was read, Margaret didn't say a word. She simply stood there, frozen, while her mouth opened and no words came out. Then she collapsed into her chair, her face streaming with tears. Her perfectly coiffed gray helmet of hair fell across her eyes. For the first time, she didn't seem powerful. She seemed small, broken, and very, very human. As the bailiff cuffed her and led her away, nobody said a word. The tyrant of Maple Ridge was finally gone, and this time, justice had a camera, a badge, and a neighborhood that refused to stay silent.